This is Jordan Poyer, safety for the Buffalo Bills, and you are now listening to Cover One Buffalo Podcast. Let's go.
Good evening and welcome to the Cover One Buffalo Podcast. You are joining your host, Greg Tompsett, tonight as we go into the next episode in our off-season series of positional previews. Tonight, we are diving into the world of quarterbacks, and who better to do that with than the QB1 of our hearts, Nate Geary. Nate, how we doing, brother?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
Not too bad. Not too bad. It's a lot of fun to be able to kind of, dive in and take a look at football for a minute. I've talked on some of the recent shows, and I certainly know you have as well, about everything going around us, and still want to remain active in that world. But I'm ready to give my mind a break for a minute and dive into football and really kind of let ourselves have some fun. So looking forward to being able to kind of go into all the goodness we have here. How are things over in your world?
Things are good. I know you're in the middle of your big move, so hopefully that's going well for you. I'm good, man. Just playing golf. I was at lunch today, and I was doing some math in my one of my apps, my golf apps, and I realized that I'm 12 rounds deep, 14 days into this month. So I'm getting out there and playing a little golf.
That's good work. That's excellent work.
Decent work.
So as we've gone through this series, each night we've gone through, and it's been fun to be able to kind of look through, we'll do some of the nerdy stuff with where the contracts lie, but the quarterback isn't as deep of a position as many players. Some of the other spots we're talking 10, 11, 12 guys, and with the quarterbacks, obviously, it's very one-sided. So we know where the majority of our conversation is going to go tonight. But we'll run through some of the other pieces here. So I've kind of advertised a lot of this series as a refresher. So I know many of our loyal listeners, this is the kind of detail that you're looking for. But I've advertised it to a lot of the casual fans, a lot of our uncles, a lot of our aunts, a lot of our family members. They hear about the Bills and they hear, hey, maybe they're not going to be too bad this year. And that I've used this series to welcome them back aboard. If you want to be able to talk about the team when you're at the water cooler, when we finally get back into the office setting, or you're talking to other people and you want to know what's going on with the team, or you maybe felt like, hey, I'm pretty sure they're still going to be terrible, but just in case, I want to know the names of the players. We're going to go through everybody for you here. So this series should be a good warm-up. We'll do one a week, the whole rest of the offseason leading up to the first preseason game, and you'll know who's going to be on this team. And if perchance we stumble into a good team this year, you'll know what's going on. So welcome aboard for anybody who hasn't been a diehard listener before. We look forward to you guys jumping in with us today. I'm going to share a screen here to be able to kind of go through a little bit of what we're talking about. And, looking from a contract standpoint, obviously, this is exactly what Brandon Beane wanted to build. Our entire quarterback room costs $9 million total. That's the 25th highest total in the NFL. That's exactly what you want, is to build a strong, talented team when the quarterback rookie contract window is in the position that it's in. And that's what he's done. It's a perfect setup. And, obviously they stumbled into what they felt was a value in the fifth round with Jake Fromm. We had Davis Webb on the practice squad last year. Matt Barkley's been a perfectly functional backup quarterback. And I would say, in my opinion, Nate, that's an average quarterback depth behind Allen. I don't think it's terrible. I don't think it's the best backup situation in the league. I think it's solid and average.
Yeah, I would say that. I know I've been on record as not being the biggest Jake Fromm fan in the world. I think this setup of dollars and cap value and percentage of cap is a really good representation of where I think the battles are actually taking place in this room. A lot of people have this assumption that Jake Fromm is a player that is going to walk onto this roster, immediately begin competing with Matt Barkley, and may really legitimately have a shot to unseat Matt Barkley. And one of the reasons people are confident in that is, well, Josh Allen doesn't need that veteran type anymore. He's getting to the point where maybe he doesn't need that extra coach in the quarterback room. But I don't really sit in that camp, Greg. I kind of sit amongst the guys that look at the bottom of this quarterback depth chart, because that's kind of what this looks like. Is I think it's a pretty reasonable depth chart of how the quarterbacks walk into training camp or even into mini camp whenever those actually begin to happen, right? And I think the real competition that's taking place on this roster is for that number 3 quarterback spot, and that's between Davis Webb and Jake Fromm. I think one of these guys is likely here, another is likely not, unless they can figure out a way. And if they want to continue to keep 3 quarterbacks on the active roster, which I would be shocked if they did. I know that they are going to get a handful of extra roster spots with the new collective bargaining agreement this year. So they are going to be able to potentially roster an extra quarterback, but is that the position on this roster you want to roster an extra player? We know, it was hard enough getting to 48. It was hard enough to get to 53. Add 4 or 5 more roster spots. It doesn't exactly make all of those jobs easier to figure out. But I'd say that the real competition we're looking at is between Davis Webb and Jake Fromm for that quarterback 3 spot. And I think there's a good chance whoever wins that competition will likely be on the practice squad. I could see Jake Fromm, unless he just had an lights out Dak Prescott type preseason, where you just don't think you're going to be able to squeeze him on the practice squad. Then I think you're talking about a potential of, do you consider moving on from Matt Barkley, or do you like Matt Barkley as a security blanket and you keep Jake Fromm around on the active roster and use that roster spot? So the cap portion of this, Greg, is really interesting because, again, very few teams in the league, and it's only a handful, as you can see, with 4.5, actually less than 4.5% of their total cap is allocated to the quarterback position. That's such a huge advantage. It's the advantage that you hear teams and general managers like, John Snyder in Seattle. You hear some of these teams, even in Houston, when they're talking about Deshaun Watson, who's, going to be due for a payday coming up. You hear these teams talk about their window to really feel their most competitive roster when they're paying their quarterback on that rookie salary. It's something that is generally talked about pretty freely in the NFL is, this is your window to spend cap elsewhere. If you can get really solid, above average, even elite level play from a quarterback on a rookie contract in the first 4 years, you're going to be in a really good position to have a over competitive roster around that player. And I think, the Bills are seeing the benefit of that right now. The question is, can Josh Allen take that step and prove that another year of this type of cap space could really see Brandon Beane execute on a window. And maybe that means swinging for a trade that he wouldn't necessarily swing for a player on an expiring contract, or maybe 1 year left on a deal, and overpay for a type of player because you want to during this type of window. So the step that Josh Allen makes is really going to make a difference of just how aggressive a Brandon Beane maybe gets at the end of this season, which I know is kind of a long ways away, but you look at the bigger picture from 30,000 feet, and you see some really interesting storylines playing out of this quarterback room.
Yeah, I think you led it up perfectly in the competition piece of it. Short of a surprise, don't get me wrong, Jake Fromm could come out and light the world on fire and genuinely beat out Matt Barkley. It's not there. It's a non-zero chance, as I like to say. It's in the realm of possibility. It's very unlikely. The real battle is, does Jake Fromm play well enough that they don't feel like they can hide him on the practice squad and that someone would scoop him up, and that they need to carry 3? Like you said, the new collective bargaining agreement gives a lot of flexibility in season, but you still need to get down to a 53-man roster. You still have to cut down to 53. You get to call guys up during the year. I've made reference before, and we'll talk about it later on in the defensive line show. That's a perfect example of a Darryl Johnson kind of spot where, hey, he was pretty rough in the season last year. We don't think somebody's going to claim him, but it'd be awful nice to be able to bring him up midseason if you need him without having to expose him to waivers, and you can call him up as that 54th or 55th guy. It's a perfect Dean Marlowe spot. It's a perfect, Dane Jackson spot. That's the kind of guys that are going to use that. Normally, short of, I know J.O. was asking in the chat here about what happens if Josh gets hurt. I'll use the famous quote from the longtime Colts offensive coordinator about, hey, why don't we practice when without Peyton Manning? He said, because that's effed and we don't practice effed. If Peyton Manning gets hurt, our season's over. It doesn't matter.
Right. We don't practice a scenario that doesn't lead us to anywhere.
Correct. So I'd love to be able to fill Bills fans with hope that don't worry, if Josh Allen goes down, everything's fine. It's not fine. It's going to be real bad if Josh Allen gets hurt. And I think Matt Barkley's not the worst backup quarterback in the league. If Josh gets hurt for 2 or 3 games, I think Barkley can help us win 1 or 2 of those games because we have a great defense and a good running game. And if it's the right kind of home game, we'll be okay. But if he's hurt, I don't expect some Nick Foles run out of this at the end of the season. So, obviously the majority of our talk tonight will be Josh, but we want to talk through those pieces. You did point to Barkley's contract. In theory, if Davis Webb had a resurgence that we haven't seen from him, or Fromm steps forward in a way we haven't seen yet, in theory, you could save $1.8 million if you cut Barkley. I think it's very unlikely that they have so many eggs in this basket. And even relative to the backup quarterback market, a $2 million cap hit is nothing in the backup quarterback market. So Matt Barkley is even a value from that standpoint. So I'll be pretty surprised if they go that route and cut him, just because of the safety net he provides and the uncertainty you'd have with a 5th round rookie quarterback. So we'll see where that goes. But I think that it's most likely we have 2 quarterbacks. And if Fromm plays well enough, it would mean that he's the 3rd quarterback on the roster. Very unlikely that it becomes just Allen and Fromm. Basically, Fromm is trying out for, can you be the 2021 forward backup because you play well enough that they can just let Barkley's deal expire this year, walk away happy, and move forward with Fromm as the long-term backup. That's what he's competing against when he's in that kind of spot.
Yeah, I totally agree with you too. And again, I want to make sure we temper some of the expectations, because there are high expectations for Jake Fromm. I think it's really surrounding the college program that he played for in Georgia. The amount you see of Jake Fromm on national television that maybe you don't see other quarterbacks that were taken in the draft. And maybe more so, you don't fully understand, or get a fully nuanced understanding of what Jake Fromm was able to do in college. Eric and I did a very thorough breakdown of Jake Fromm, and both of us sort of left thinking there is some sort of untapped potential that we do see in Jake Fromm. Like, we believe he's a guy that really will benefit from like NFL coaching, but there is a lot wrong with the mechanics of Jake Fromm. And that's why, for me, he's not ready to walk into an NFL game this year or next year and be a player that can like help advance the roster, like help advance this team's agenda, which is, to be a playoff team. And I think if Jake Fromm's put in this situation where he has to play meaningful snaps, I think it could very well turn into a Nathan Peterman type situation. I think they both lack in the areas of consistent arm strength. And because of that, they're really forced to be perfectionists. Much like Matt Barkley. Matt Barkley doesn't have exactly that. Yeah, right. I mean, you couldn't talk about opposite types of quarterbacks than Josh Allen and then the rest of the 3. They both, the 3 of them outside of Josh Allen, really lack that elite arm strength, or even in a lot of cases, in the case of Jake Fromm, Davis Webb, and Matt Barkley, I think they're borderline NFL arms. Like, they are on sort of the cusp of not being that. And say what you will about Jake Fromm. Barely
minimum qualifying requirement. They're literally minimum.
And you can see how quickly players like that can flame out of the league if they're not placed in the right system, because they need to be in systems that are really predicated on timing and rhythm. They have to have a ton of talent around them. They need to have a great offensive line. So yeah, as much as I think all 3 guys can be competitive and sort of compete for a backup, the idea of any of them seeing meaningful snaps for this team is certainly a nightmare situation.
Yeah, and it's something that, again, the questions in the chat, J.O. had asked about, do we see a big signing beforehand? Obviously I joked in our Cover One Slack channel that, like, hey, Colin Kaepernick's probably a better alignment from a skill set standpoint with what Josh Allen does in a game, and he's probably better than Matt Barkley. I said it very tongue in cheek, although I don't think it's wrong. I think that statement's probably accurate. I don't see that being the kind of move that Sean McDermott or Brandon Beane are looking for from an attention standpoint right now. Whatever team, if anyone gives him a camp invite, it's going to be an incredible spotlight on that team. The longer we wait, if it gets to the point where Cam Newton is a possible backup and is possibly open to that, I don't think Brandon Beane and Sean McDermott are at the bottom of that list. I don't know when he gets to that point of when no quarterback gets hurt in camp or nobody in preseason to where an obvious starting spot comes open. If it comes to a point where Newton says, hey, I got to chalk up my losses, try again for the 2021 market, get myself into a winning team, and just try to look like a good soldier to rebuild some image value dollars. I don't know that the Bills are the top of that list, but I also don't know that they're the bottom of that list.
You don't. Let's use an example of a real world example, right? Like if you live in the city of Miami, you recognize that you are potentially years of climate change away from not having your city any longer. Like it could be underwater, right? And if you're the mayor of Miami, are you going to fortify your home this year, surround it by bricks and sand, so that in 50 years, if climate change really does what scientists say it's going to happen, and there's no longer an area that they'd be safe, everyone around it would be like, well, if he's prepping for the worst, what are we supposed to do? Like what, that guy's the most, does he know something we don't know? So I think what they want to do, and if you're Brandon Beane, if you're Sean McDermott, as much as I think the logical move, I have firmly said that I think the Bills have a tremendous blind spot at the quarterback position. If Josh Allen has a Teddy Bridgewater, knock on wood, a Teddy Bridgewater type catastrophic injury, if he just flat out I hate using Nathan Peterman's name twice in a podcast, but here we are. Let's say he has a Nathan Peterman type beginning of the season where he's literally going out there and throws 4 or 5 interceptions in the first game, and it's just as bad in the second game. And all of a sudden, because that's the thing with Josh, and what we know is if things get murky early, it can snowball on Josh. And if that were to happen in a year with so much expectation early on in the season, and you have to pull him off the field, like, man, they're just not in a situation where they can overcome that in long term. And that's the thing that you sort of have to have this balancing act with, is you have a playoff ready, I think AFC championship caliber roster. I'm not quite ready to tell you that they're a Super Bowl roster. There are certain boxes that need to be checked and can't be checked until you play football games to be considered a Super Bowl roster, no matter what you say in the preseason.
Any team, I don't think anyone can tell me that the Bills are better than Kansas City or Baltimore, but there's no other AFC team that you can tell me are better than the Bills besides those two. Yeah. So, if you're already third, that means you have a shot. But yeah, I think they're right in that running. But yeah, it's crazy to put them above what Kansas City or Baltimore did last year.
So with that being said, it's like, I could totally understand the mindset and the process of saying, you better have a guy you truly can rely on, a guy that can step in, and maybe you don't lose a beat at all with your starting quarterback, or maybe you have a veteran presence that can come in and lead a Super Bowl roster if a Josh Allen just doesn't work out or an injury happens. Now, can you get a Colin Kaepernick or Cam Newton at the end of July? Can you get him in early August? And I guess the answer to that question is I guess it remains to be seen. I am a little surprised to see Cam Newton still available. I don't, frankly, I don't understand it. I think there's this perception that he's a distraction for more reasons than just his off the field. I think a lot of people are concerned in this particular situation of him coming in and dwarfing Josh. He's a big personality. If Cam Newton showed up at St. John Fisher in a regular season, in a normal non-COVID season, where are the cameras going? Like, where are the reporters going during training camp? Are they going to be going to Josh Allen? I don't know. Like, I think if Cam Newton's at camp, the story is going to be, well, Cam, are you comfortable being the backup quarterback? And the story isn't Josh, what are you doing to take your year 3 step? It's Cam Newton. What are you doing to make sure Cam Newton doesn't take your job? And then it just becomes this sort of circus and storyline. And I think it's this weird balancing act. You have to sort of balance the risk factors and what those effects of you bringing that personality on the roster could potentially do. And I'm still, frankly, in the camp that says, until this organization, this group that's running it right now shows us that there's crack in the armor, there's cracks in the foundation of their decision-making process, this is something I need to trust them on. And if they believe they've seen enough from Josh Allen that you can go into a season with Matt Barkley, but also have a plan B, and maybe their plan B is Cam Newton, we just don't know. Maybe they've already spoken to Cam Newton, and there's a mutual understanding that there are situations where we are going to reach out to you, but until those happen, this is nothing more than preliminary. That could be totally the case.
I don't think that's crazy at all. They say, hey, as of right now, we hit, I can see a conversation where Bean and or McDermott say, Cam, we think you're a starting caliber quarterback. We don't have a starting spot. If Josh gets hurt, obviously you're our first phone call. If at some point you haven't signed yet and something happens to where we feel like we're not going the direction that we both feel definitively like we are going right now, if that changes, we'd be open to that. But I would see it as that kind of conversation. We see you as a starting quarterback. We don't have a starting spot available. That's not what we're looking to do right now. If things change for either group, we'll call you back. Right. But I think that's the kind of conversation that's out there. Like you said, there's certain criteria that those things haven't happened right now. If one of those change, you'd be our first phone call. I bet that's the kind of conversation that would have happened.
Absolutely. And, I wouldn't throw away the key that the Bills could be, this type of organization could be the type that might, if he's off the market, that a Colin Kaepernick wouldn't necessarily be off the board. I do wonder, from a fan perspective, if this city is mature enough to handle something like that. It'd be a challenge. I'd have my doubts about it. But having said that, I wouldn't throw it past. I think they've got easily, when Josh Allen says it, I believe it. When other players around the league say it about the Bills, I believe it. I think there's a pretty strong consensus that if the Bills aren't one of the best locker rooms in the football, that they are maybe the best locker room in football. They're the best, in terms of continuity, in terms of just, Sean McDermott says it, when players come here, they turn into their best selves, right? And I think that's this persona that's not only living within here in Buffalo, but it lives outside of these doors. And I think that's really important. And I think if you're going to look at one team who has the stability, who has the ability to take on that type of distraction, I do think it's the Bills. But I definitely wouldn't put my money on them. And especially, again, I think we're talking about worst case scenarios, which is not always necessarily, it's June 14th. Sometimes worst case scenarios is what we have to talk about, especially in a situation like we have. So, but at the same time, I think we all sit in a place that we're carefully, strategically excited. I think we're all confident to a certain extent. I think there are shades of confidence. I don't think everyone has the same level of confidence in Josh Allen, but I don't think I think that fraction, that portion of this fan base that is really just Josh Allen's terrible is shrinking, and it's very small. And I think we're at this area where we're sort of layered out of, well, just how much really faith do you have in Josh Allen? And I think it really goes from just very little, but I can see it, to he's the guy, he's the franchise. And there's so many layers in between that. I think it's really important to kind of acknowledge that and understand that, because it's not a black and white thing. It's not just in this fan base, but it's in the national perspective too.
So I think that's a perfect lead into where the next portion of our conversation goes, which is Josh Allen. I mean, obviously we've queued up now the backup situation. We both are on the same page that it's Davis Webb and Jake Fromm for that third spot. If one of them played well enough to force a third spot, it would be third. Unlikely that they unseat Matt Barkley. We think it's likely we go into the season with Matt Barkley short of an injury where you were to make a phone call for one of the bigger names out there. And that puts all of our eggs in the basket of Josh Allen. And I've described that in other conversations, that all the other moves we've made, what I've described as the best other 52-man roster in the NFL. And I believe that. I think that we have the deepest overall roster short of quarterback in the NFL, which means the Stephon Diggs trade, having 9 NFL caliber offensive linemen, having 9 NFL caliber defensive linemen, having arguably the best secondary in the NFL, they're the best back 7 coverage unit in the NFL, including linebackers, is half of the battle. And the other half, all by himself, is Josh Allen. And I think the way to frame it up, I'm going to share some numbers here. It's not as good as your Miami Mayor sandbag analogy, but I'm going to try. If you look at Josh Allen's second year, played 16 games, 10-6. It's counting the he didn't really play in that Jets game, so it's really 15 games. 58% completion percentage, was over 60% for a good chunk of the year, 3,000 yards, 20 touchdowns, 9 interceptions. I found 2 other quarterbacks and went through with a lot of work Sal Capaccio did. I thought he had a great comparison and dove into that, plus another name that gets thrown out there often that had very similar second years with then very divergent third years. So on the good end of the scale is Matt Ryan. Matt Ryan's second year, again, a winning team, came off 9-5, 58% completion percentage, 2,900 yards, 22 touchdowns, 14 interceptions. Obviously not the runner that Josh is, but some more passing attempts. On the bad end of the scale, you had Mitch Trubisky, again, 11-3, 66% completion percentage, 3,200 yards, 24 touchdowns, 12 interceptions. People dismiss how solid Mitch Trubisky's second year was.
That's right.
People in Chicago thought they had the guy coming off, that season. He was 11-4. They were 11-3. He was 11-3. They went 12-4 that year with him as the starting quarterback. They thought they had their guy. Going into that next year, he takes a significant step back, showed pretty clearly he wasn't the guy. Now it looks like they brought in Nick Foles to take their job. Matt Ryan steps forward with an incredible season, probably his second best short of his MVP year. 62%, went up another 4%, 3,700 yards, 28 touchdowns, 9 interceptions. That was what Sal put out there was, can you imagine if Josh Allen took that kind of step forward from a passing standpoint while maintaining his threat, if not the raw numbers,
Correct.
but his threat of the running game? That's the kind of season where legitimately, that's not even an exaggeration, if Josh Allen had this kind of year, the Bills would go 13-3. If Josh Allen goes 3,700 passing yards, 28 touchdowns, and 9 interceptions, the Bills are 13-3. I don't think that's an exaggeration.
They could sprinkle in between 6 to 10 more rushing touchdowns. I think you can talk about the factors outside of Josh Allen. If Josh Allen is able to put those sort of raw numbers up, I think you're talking about a running game that is amplified in its efficiency because they have an efficient passing offense that's a danger. I think you're talking about an offensive line, right, that is likely going to be one of the top units in the league if teams have to respect Josh Allen and have to play 2 deep safeties. And I think that's one of the big issues is, can Josh Allen beat the cover zero? We talked about that a lot in that Ravens game last year, and the answer to that question was no, he cannot beat the cover zero look. And he started to have success later on in the season. Dallas game, he had some success against cover zero, and then that Ravens game happened and everyone was like, whoa, what do we do from here? Teams are figuring out how to stop Josh. And I think, there's going to be phases to defensive coordinators every year that come in and add sprinkles and be able to, throw something at Josh that he may not have seen before. But I think the most interesting thing about the development process is what it means for everybody else. Last year, I know you and I talked about this. We talked about, okay, going into year 3, there are several players that we looked at, Tre'Davious White, Matt Milano. This is last year, right? That was going into year 3. And we said, if Deion Dawkins, if Tre'Davious White, if Matt Milano, if one of those 3 turn into a blue chip, legitimate, like top 2, top 3 player at their position, that changed the dynamics of this team. And one did, Tre'Davious White. And I think the other 2 put themselves
took steps forward.
Yes, yeah. I think firmly put themselves in the above average category, the top 10 to 12 in their position. And I think when you start talking about that this year, you look at this Bills team and the players that you look at, Josh Allen. Dawson Knox is only going into year 2, but it feels like it's not. Tremaine Edmonds, right? But if Dawson Knox feels like an interesting one to me, like he could be on the verge of something. Devin Singletary, right? Like if Devin Singletary takes a step, if the running game's capable of taking a step and they're not, and Frank Gore is a legend in the game, but he was an anchor. He held the offense back from an efficiency standpoint. When he was on the field, teams knew they were running the football, and he lacked the success necessary to earn playing time, but he did anyway because of his status. As a shout out,
anyone who didn't see that Shelkapedia piece that he put together showed exactly statistically how bad Frank Gore held them back. It was for someone who watched every game and analyzed every game, it was eye-opening how bad it was that we hurt the team by giving Frank Gore touches. It was eye-opening.
Eye-opening for sure, and that's exactly what that was sort of the piece I was getting at, because when you think about all of these other factors, that if Josh Allen can be better, there's going to be a residual ripple effect of other positions, other players, other units, and that could be special teams, because maybe the punting unit isn't on the field as much. Maybe that means the Bills are getting better field position. Maybe that means the Bills are putting defenses in better field position, and opposing offenses in worse field position.
Yeah, correct, more late passing games with your ears.
These are nuanced like things maybe we're not thinking about if Josh Allen takes that step, but these are all things that you could legitimately look at, because I think we're all really confident if the Bills defense stays the same, man, they're going to be in a really good place. I think, they do need to tie some things up in the run game. I think all of us, are understanding of that. But I think for the most part, if they stay the same or regress just slightly, this is a team that on the offense, if they could take a step forward, there's just so many other factors that could lead to them being a 13-3 team outside of Allen hitting those numbers. That's sort of the important statistic that he gets to those numbers. I think you're right. I think they are a 13-win team, but the other things that would be amplified because of that success is really what excites me.
Well, you talk about last year. It's similar. We talked about the fact that Bills fans went from the worst offensive line in the year in the league to an average offensive line. And it seemed amazing that we actually had blocking. And really, we just went to a pretty okay offensive line. Mm-hmm. And that's a good analogy for the offense overall. We went from, at one point in 2018, the worst offense in NFL history at one point during the season, and ended up being one of the bottom two in the overall league and arguably the worst offense in the league, to now okay, slightly below average offense. If we just take another small step forward, we don't need to be, the 2018 Rams. We don't need to be the run and shoot, Oilers of the 90s. We don't have to light the league on fire and all of a sudden, don't get me wrong, that'd be fun. But we just need to take another step forward. If we just go from, depending on what metric you look at, we were 19th to 23rd, that kind of offense, below average, but okay. If we now move that up to 12th to 15th with this defense, all of a sudden people don't realize how big that tilts those game scripts that you referenced and the situations you put the defense or special teams in, more favorable field goal attempts, more favorable passing down situations where you can now use that defensive line rotation, that the cornerbacks know that you have to pass and they can get ready, that Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer can disguise more coverages because they don't need to be worrying about you running. It tilts each little thing in your favor to allow you to do those things. I love that point of all the other little things that it can do. I think that, I like some of the steps Josh has taken. I know Eric just pointed out some video breakdowns because Eric's a psychopath and literally broke down the throwing motion and offhand placement in the Florida workout videos because he's a crazy person. But he talked about the fact that between Josh reaching out and Dable setting it up, Josh talked with Peyton Manning, Brett Favre, and Tony Romo and was going through things with mechanics, off-season approach. A couple of the comments came out about Peyton Manning talking to him about organizing separate situational Zoom meetings with himself and the tight ends, himself and the offensive line, going over blitz calls, going over all those different things, set it up himself. And he's doing that. Well, Romo apparently gave him some tidbits on offhand placement when you were throwing. And again, Eric's a crazy person and actually noticed it and took video from his days in college and his rookie year versus where he was showing his offhand placement, especially on some of the deeper passes, and how noticeable it was, and that how it can give him just that little bit more control, that little bit more confidence, that little bit more stability and consistency. And it's little things like that if he's able to rein some of those things in, and then you combine that with, last year, hey, on cover zero in a tense situation, he wasn't sure who was going to be open. Well, now he probably feels pretty comfortable. Stephon Diggs can beat his guy, and you now have that step. Those little things could add up, and at minimum, put him in a position that we're going to know because we've eliminated so many other excuses, factors of what's there. By the end of this season, we're going to know for better or worse. That's a scary thing to think about, but I feel confident we're going to know whether we have it or not.
Yeah, that's why, when you talk about worst case scenarios, I mean, I kind of talked about it on Sports Talk Saturday this weekend. I talked about, what was some of our biggest fears of what could happen with a roster that all of us feel really good about. And, one of those things is like an injury to Josh Allen because of everything else that could potentially go wrong. With the season going down down the tubes, and then having Matt Barkley or all those other things we talked about earlier. The other thing is the creeping in of doubt and excuse. And that's the one thing that I think this organization has really passed with flying colors is eliminating, developmental and evaluation excuses for not only their own bias as an organization that drafted Josh Allen. They have to understand that there is a bias that lives within them when they're evaluating Josh Allen, is that they're always going to sort of give Josh the benefit of the doubt.
They want him to succeed.
They want him to succeed. Yeah. So does everybody, right? So the people that really want Josh to succeed are always going to give him the benefit of the doubt. And an injury could really just prolong an evaluation period for another year and a half. And that's just not where we want to be as an organization. We don't want to be looking at 2022 thinking, okay, this is a big year for Josh. Like we want that to just be 2022 needs to be, yeah, this is Josh getting $40 million a year. Like that's the conversation we want to be having. What we don't want to be having is the conversation we had last year or really this offseason again 2 years from now because of an injury that takes a year and a half to fully, because that's what we'll talk about is, the ACL really takes a full season, and that full season back, we can't really take everything we saw because the knee, and that's just, that would be, in my opinion, the worst nightmare of that. You know what I mean? It's just the excuse. And I think, to your point, they've done such a good job of eliminating all of those excuses, those ancillary excuses. And to your point, cover zero is a perfect example of that. Now he understands, in his mind what he's supposed to do, but now he's actually got a weapon. He's got a guy in Stephon Diggs
he's got a first read.
When a defensive coordinator is going to say, cover zero is a way to confuse Josh Allen, but do I have the corner? Do I have the ability to cover these guys one-on-one and leave them on an island? And there's going to be more no's to that answer than it was in 2019.
Yeah, I just joked with that earlier with someone on Twitter that, that's cute. The Dolphins signed a second guy for $15 million plus who can't defend Stephon Diggs. That's great.
Yeah, right. Exactly right.
It leads into our final part of the discussion here, and I'm going to bring up another screen to share. It's bringing up the financial discussion of the new CBA and the impact on Josh Allen. So right now we're in a really strong position. His cap hit this year is 5.8. A first-round pick rookie deal is all guaranteed. You can't really get out of any of it. So 5.8 this year, 6.9 next year, no matter what. We have 2 good, solid, cheap years left on his rookie deal. The new rules, and Mitch Trubisky's a good analogy for it, is that the hesitancy was some of the situations you saw before where you could pick up the 5th-year option on a player and still kind of string it along. And if you then later on rescinded it, the money wasn't guaranteed. It was only for injury. It was only guaranteed via injury. And if the guy didn't get hurt and then you decided, we changed our mind, you could rescind the offer and nothing really happened. You were just able to kind of take it back. So the new CBA, once you exercise the 5th-year option during the spring of the 4th year, so that's when it would be after this season completes. We just did it with Tre'Davious White a month or so ago. Sometime after the draft, usually it's May 15th is the deadline. We would have to decide, do we exercise the 5th-year option? We'll have the same conversation with Tremaine Edmonds and the linebacker show on Josh Allen. And at that point, if you do that, both the $6.9 million for 2021 and whatever that number is, and I'll get to that in a second, in 2022 becomes fully guaranteed. He's going to get both of those years. So here's where the silver lining and the risk reward comes in of what you just described. Let's assume that we don't have an injury, because that's the biggest question mark you can throw in here, is that I think we are going to have a definitive answer no matter what. The new CBA built in an escalator that's now performance-based. Before, it used to just be based on where you were drafted. Instead now, if you are an original designation for the Pro Bowl, not an alternate like Andre Roberts and Tremaine Edmonds were last year and that they got brought on and played, but they weren't originally voted onto the team. If you are an original election to the Pro Bowl, there's an escalator and it moves up to the 3rd to the 19th highest salary. If you're not, it's the 5th to the 25th highest salary. Don't quote me on those. I'm pretty sure those are the numbers, but it's that range. At quarterback, it makes a material difference. If Josh Allen does not make the Pro Bowl, his 5th-year option number is $27 million for 2022. If he does make the Pro Bowl, it's $32 million for 2022. Now, some fans are like, oh my gosh, that's $5 million more. $32 million sounds like a lot. The reason I said I think it's an easy decision is if he plays well enough that we feel comfortable exercising the 5th-year option, and that we go, let's say he has the same season as last year, pretty good, electric plays, some inconsistent things, but pretty good. We go 10-6 again. Things are just solid. I think we're going to exercise the 5th-year option. We want it back for another year after that. We want to keep seeing it. We want to see the 4th year and the 5th year to really decide, and they're going to exercise it, and it costs $27 million. If we have a season where Josh Allen is one of the 3 top quarterbacks, and let's say the Pro Bowl is Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, and Josh Allen, and he's an original election to the Pro Bowl, we're going to feel fine giving him $32 million because he just had a Pro Bowl season, which means we probably went 12-4, 13-3, and we're going to be fine with that either way. If it goes the wrong direction, we're not offering the 5th-year option. We're just going to ride out the 4th year and figure out what happened like we did with Shaq Lawson and hope that he balls out in the 4th year and we have to use the franchise tag, which is $34 or $35 million, and it's just going to cost that range anyway. So it's interesting the way the new CBA structured it. It can get more expensive, but it's in direct correlation with performance, that if he does well, we're not going to feel bad about giving him that money because he earned it. So just to break it down for fans again, simple. If he doesn't make the Pro Bowl, the 5th-year option decided by next spring after seeing this whole year is $27 million. If he makes the Pro Bowl in an original election, it goes to $32 million, and then you could negotiate beyond there. I think a lot of teams learned from the Rams' mistake that they exercised the 5th-year option and gave Jared Goff his extension all at once. I don't think we're going to see that happen as often, if at all, anymore.
You certainly won't. Let's need
he did all the rest of the GMs a favor. That's an easy one to wave and say, yeah, we're not going to do the Jared Goff.
Yeah. And again, I hate to be the doom and gloom. Jared Goff is your worst case scenario, right? I think
good enough to get a contract and then bad enough to sink you with it.
Yeah. And that's why I think that's why the 5th-year option is there for teams. It was a move that Los Angeles made out of panic. Realizing that they needed to determine which of their core they were going to keep. And obviously Todd Gurley's no longer part of that core. And you see the devastating effects it can have on your salary cap when you misappropriate that type of money before a guy gets his 5th-year option. I think they made the mistake on both Gurley and Goff, if I'm not mistaken. That they made that 4th year. They signed the extension after they I think they did it for both guys. Am I wrong on that?
Yeah, no, Gurley was a full year early. They had because Gurley's was the same as Zeke, where they were both holding out with a full year left before it was even getting to the 5th-year option. And that what they ended up doing was you could have let Gurley play the 4th year, exercise the 5th-year option, and those two would have cost you, I can't remember the number, whatever it was. They ended up only having him on the roster for that 4th and 5th year, but instead of paying him what those two together would have been like $11 million, they paid him like $24 million for
and he's going to count
years.
And he's going to count a ton against their dead cap.
Oh, and destroyed their cap.
Yeah,
destroyed it. Yeah, they completely mangled that situation, and it's a great litmus test and case study that someone as diligent as Brandon Beane is, I don't think was going to go that heavy into the, kind of all in mentality of what Snead did, but it's a great reason of not going that far overboard. No matter what the scenario is, you have to plan ahead. And I think we're seeing that right now. Again, we'll get into it for the linebacker and offensive line shows. I'm curious if we see early extensions for Dawkins and Milano. I felt really strongly it was going to be all of them, Poyer, Dawkins, and Milano, all getting extensions. And now I'm feeling more and more like, hey, maybe it's 2 out of the 3 and then a franchise tag next year because they might string it along. I don't know what methods are going to use.
Yeah, and I think somebody in the chat just made an interesting point that I kind of want to go to before we end things, because I think it does tie into all this, and it has to do with Brian Daboll.
Yeah.
Now, I think maybe the most interesting element to a big step for Josh Allen in year 3 is what that means for Brian Daboll's chances of becoming an NFL head coach. And if you talk to people, smart people that cover the game, that know the X's and O's, that watch Josh Allen, they all sort of come away and they all sort of tell me the same thing. They say, yeah, Josh took a nice step in year 2. Brian Daboll's grossly underrated.
Yes.
Brian Daboll does not get the respect around the league in national media circuits.
I was saying not around the league,
not around the league,
around the fans of the
around
league.
the fans and around the national media. That's absolutely right. And I think that's part of what I think is the concern here for me is, let's say Josh Allen does take that third year step. And let's say that we're in a situation where Brian Daboll is getting significant offers. Now the question is, is he looking for the first job that comes his way? Because if the Detroit Lions come calling, if a situation that isn't ideal comes calling, Jacksonville, does he say, thanks, but no thanks? I'm in a situation where, I think I might be able to win a Super Bowl. And if I'm getting the bottom feeding teams giving me head coaching opportunities, this won't be the last time I have a head coaching opportunity. These are all really interesting questions that you sort of have to ask, because going into year 4, I would be concerned about what happens to the offense if Brian Daboll leaves and say they aren't able to bring in a Joe Brady, right? Like if they can't go get the best college offensive coordinator and they're sort of Ken Dorsey, you've never called plays before, but you've been here, and maybe that's just the natural succession of things, right? Like then you start to worry, well, year 4, this is also a pivotal year. We know Josh took the step last year, but year 4 becomes more important, because if he takes a step back, man, you're in a tough spot going into year 5. So like, and again, I hate to be doom and gloom, but I think these are all conversations we can have, because I think it's an obvious area you're led to when you talk about a step from Josh Allen is what happens to Brian Daboll.
I'm going to make the case that there's no scenario that we want Brian Daboll as the offensive coordinator in 2021. Because either we had a good enough season where people realize, hey, man, we all thought Josh Allen was he was never the automatic bust that the draft Twitter world tried to make him out to be, but what they misinterpreted as a historic level of opportunity to bust meant he was more likely to bust than almost any quarterback in NFL history drafted that high. NFL teams saw that as well. If they all of a sudden see that, holy cow, he didn't bust, he developed and improved. We weren't sure at first, but wow, look what they did in this third year. That credit is going to go, fair or not, to Brian Daboll. That's going to be where that goes. And there's going to be a team that says, oh, I want that guy to come do that for our guy. And it will be a good problem to have. And that I've warned people that, hey, I actually like the idea of the internal succession planning with Ken Dorsey for the idea of sustainability. And I don't think it was accurate last year, but I can talk myself into now having multiple years alongside right in Josh's hip pocket, learning from Daboll, being ready, especially with the idea of, how meticulous he is with his offseason planning things, of saying, hey, Ken, I need you to prepare as though you're the next guy to call plays here and be ready for that. That conversation has happened. So 100%. I don't know that that's the answer, but they've certainly had that conversation. That you could talk me into that being the possibility. The other end of that spectrum is, if nobody wants Brian Daboll as a head coaching candidate, we're not going to want him back as our offensive coordinator again, just out of some semblance of continuity that, we don't want to change the voice in Josh's ear. Because if he doesn't have a season good enough to where he's getting that, he's now endorsed by Belichick, endorsed by Saban, coached underneath both of them, national championship offense court. His resume checks every box.
Water, right? I mean, he's the only thing that he lacks is a blessing from the Pope. And, I think for me, it's like, you look around football circles, that's plenty. That is a nice enough resume to get just about any head coaching job in, power conference 5. And we shouldn't rule out if, a great college job opens that Brian Daboll doesn't potentially do that. Because here's the thing, it's every coach's. Brian Daboll, as much as Brian Daboll's from Buffalo, he went to St. Francis High School. Don't ever think that Brian Daboll doesn't love the fact that he's the offensive coordinator of the Buffalo Bills. Yeah. But at the end of the day, he got into coaching and is in the position he is in right now because eventually he wants to be a head coach in the National Football League or in Power 5 football in college. So I think I'm in the same boat as you. As I think a best case scenario is come 2021 that the Bills are looking for a new offensive coordinator, because I think it means that this team did everything that it needed to do offensively to put him in a position to take a job.
Yeah. I can find a way to thread the needle that it was just good enough, and that this is going to sound weird to say in a separate conversation. I think there's been a backlog of minority coaching candidates who your Eric Bieniemys, your Leslie Frazier's, that have not gotten opportunities, that I think there might be a market correction this coming off season. And I don't want anyone to interpret that as some forced, undeserved opportunity. No one's hiring a person because they're a person of color.
No one's doing that charity work.
We've had far more qualified people of color that were candidates that have not gotten jobs. I have a feeling we're going to see a market correction in that in the next couple off seasons.
Jalen Richard is another one.
Absolutely. There's a chance that guys like a Brian Daboll could then be what Eric Bieniemy's been the last 2 years, and all of a sudden be the number 2 choice for 3 or 4 jobs and not end up getting one. So I can talk myself into a scenario where we still have a pretty good season. He gets multiple interviews and just doesn't happen to get one of the jobs, or the one that he gets offered is a 1 in 15 Jacksonville job, who also got the a 3 in 13 Jacksonville job that somehow got the 3rd pick in the draft and isn't going to get Trevor Lawrence or Justin Fields. And all of a sudden, oh, I don't want that job. That's the only one. I can talk myself into a path where we have a good season and Brian Daboll stays, but for the most part, either he's going to be gone and that's a great problem to have, or he's not going to be gone and that's a different problem to have.
It could be. I think, like to your mentioning there could be a scenario that he's back and it's a good thing. But I would suspect that the likelihood of that happening is 1 in 100.
Yeah. So, we'll see where that takes us. I think that's the way we want to handle these shows as we go through this offseason program. Is we're going to talk about the depth of the program, of that position group. We're going to talk about the roster bubble battles that can be there. In other positions, we're going to talk about Brandon Beane's favorite, his comp pick bingo alternative, where that's his cut down day trade targets. I think that's not in play at the quarterback position, but I think almost every other position on the roster, maybe short of tight end, you have those candidates. We have some guys at the back end of our roster who are going to be struggling to make it that are good enough to be on other rosters. A lot of them, maybe 10 of them. We are going to see multiple cut down day trades. We didn't see that here in the quarterback group. Then we're going to talk about the starter at the position. We're going to talk about the financials of where that leads us, what those next steps are going to be, what the contract options are, where we're looking at for this year. Obviously, right now we're in a great financial position, and we're hoping that we're making an easy decision that, yes, I can't wait to give Josh Allen $36 million a year, whatever the going rate is. Or heck, I hope it's 40, because I hope he plays that well that we're excited to give him $40 million. That's a wonderful problem to have. But either way, that's where the finances of this goes. And we'll use some of those comparisons, some of those stat models that kind of show where those things fall from a financial situation going forward and what our options are. And each time I'm going to try to bring on some enlightening guests such as Nate and some other folks who have expertise in that position group or with the Bills as a whole. So Nate, appreciate you coming on tonight. Why don't you let the folks know what are some of the things you have coming up here on the Saturday show and everything else you have cooking?
Yeah, man. So it's, we are in the June month and we're roughly 40 something days away from when training camps are set to open. So I am preparing for what is going to be a long season ahead, hopefully. Sports Talk Saturday, as we get closer and closer to the season, more and more national guests. I try to bring new, fresh voices from around not only the league, but the country across different sports and platforms. I do that every Saturday. And of course that's 11 to 2 on WGR. Follow me at Geary Sports on Twitter. And thanks for having me, brother.
Awesome. Appreciate it. We talked about it here and let you guys know that, we've shared many different thoughts on our social media platforms. I've talked in depth on some of the other shows about the many things going on around us. We're going to try to use these shows to be an escape and a moment away for you. But each show, I am going to challenge you to try to do something good in your community for a neighbor, have a good, honest conversation with someone in your family, have a difficult conversation with someone in your family, do something nice for someone, or go talk to someone you don't normally talk to that's outside of your circle. And hopefully if all of us do a little bit more of that, we can find some good solutions to the things going on around us. So I wish you all well. Appreciate Nate's time tonight. You have been listening to Cover One Buffalo, and we are out.